Thanks so much for that talk on living with water, and we're going to talk some more about water, although more in a rural setting than in an urban setting. Our guest for this panel, called Sense of Place, is Jesmyn Ward. She's the 2011 National Book Award winner for her novel Salvage the Bones, as well as the author of Where the Line Bleeds, Men We Reaped, and a forthcoming novel in 2017, as well as an anthology of contemporary African-American writers and writers of color as well. Thanks so much for being with us.
It's good to be here.
So in Salvage the Bones, you don't really start with Katrina. Katrina comes in pretty much at the final part of the book. And you focus on this family in this very specific place at Bois Sauvage in the days leading up to Katrina. And that gives us a chance to really get to know this place, to get to know this family. How did you come up with that as the timeline that you wanted to depict in the work?
The way that I came up with that timeline was I wanted to, write about the kind of people who weren't able to leave, right?
It's not even a consideration for them.
No, because they've, they lived in that place. Their families has lived in that place for generations. They've never left. They've established this routine that they follow whenever they're threatened by a hurricane. So because that's what they've always done, that's what they do, and they don't have the resources to go anywhere. And so because I specifically wanted to write about that kind of family and address that, it made sense to me narratively, right, to write about the days that are leading up to the hurricane, so that I'm able to spend time, with these people and really, humanize them and have time to really develop their story. So that's how I figured, out the timeline for the novel.
And was that important to you because of the way that you saw the rest of the nation stigmatize people who didn't leave, or ask the question, what were they doing there when this giant storm was coming?
Yes. After the storm, because I was I live in a small town in South Mississippi called DeLisle, right? So, which is right on the coast. And so I was at home for Hurricane Katrina, with my family, right, which is my family lives in a community which is just like the community in the book, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I heard all those things after Katrina happened, right? I mean, there was people, like the people in my community, were being blamed for staying. They were being, at least the conversation that was going on around them just cast them as really stupid. Mm-hmm. And then I had, I was privy to conversations where people were wondering why when people were asking, okay, so why didn't they leave, one, and then why would they go back and rebuild, right? I mean, if this is going to continue happening, if the storms are going to get worse and they're going to come in a quicker succession, then why would you even go back, and why would you even rebuild? Because it makes no sense. And that made me really angry, and I wanted to write against that because I felt like people really, they weren't understanding the culture of this place, and how we have this history of every year we have hurricane seasons. We've been dealing with this for a very long time, and they weren't understanding. I think they weren't understanding the humanity of the people here, and that was really frustrating for me.
You live in DeLisle mm-hmm. now yourself. How do you understand risk internally? Because this is a place with no flood protection and no plans for flood protection. How do you internalize that?
It's hard, right? Because this is really difficult. In some ways, it seems like, when you live in a place like DeLisle, right, and my family is working class and poor, and we've been that way for a long time. So therefore, when we build in DeLisle, we're not always able to build in the proper ways, right? In the ways that we've been sort of instructed that we need to build, right? We're not always able to elevate our houses, however many feet they say we need to elevate them. Sometimes because, land is a precious commodity, right? I mean, so maybe the areas that we're building in are pretty much guaranteed to flood. So in some ways, it's like we have to resign ourselves to the fact that when another Hurricane Katrina comes along, we're just going to lose everything. but I mean, you do what you can with what you have.
And it's not necessarily a sense of choice. It's not considered that we could become mobile and go somewhere else, that this is just our place and that's it.
Exactly.
And that's something that I think is less and less common in America. I mean, we're here talking about New Orleans, and in the past decade there's been such a focus on cities and this sort of re-falling in love with cities, and the experience of rural areas to disaster seems in some ways very different. What does Dalil look like now, and what do you think if you were to write, you know, Salvage the Bones 2, which no one is suggesting, would you imagine what that community would look like 10 years from now or 20 years from now?
I mean, in some ways, I think it will look the same as it does, just because I know that, you know, I mean, my community largely consists of, say, 7 or 8 huge extended families, right? And they're not going anywhere. So in some ways, I think that it would look the same, but in other ways, I think it'll be different because, you know, a lot of people who lived in Pasquistan, in Long Beach, right? So these cities that are right on, you know, the Gulf of Mexico, a lot of those people that were sort of like displaced by the storm, their homes were destroyed, they moved further up country. And so it's changed the community or the makeup of my town a bit because, you know, a lot of those people have built houses where I am. But so I mean, you know, it's a mixed bag.
The family in Salvage the Bones is a traumatized family from the get-go. They've lost their mother, there are 4 children, 3 boys, and then the story is told through the daughter, Esh, who's a teenager and who has just found out she's pregnant. And their father's pretty dysfunctional. They live with poverty, they live with struggle, they live with violence. Dogfighting figures prominently in the book. So in a way, by the time the hurricane comes, it's beyond insult to injury. This is a family already in crisis, and in a way, a place and a community largely in crisis as well. The people who live around them are mostly like them. When you think of a hurricane's impact on a family and a community like that, what does it do? Is the blow in some ways ironically less because they're already living so close to the line? Is the blow worse? And how does that figure differently for a community already in trauma when such a major trauma strikes?
I mean, I think there's the possibility that it's a difficult question to answer because I feel like, you know, in some respects, right after the storm, at least in my community, it sort of unraveled it a bit, right? I mean, because, you know, everyone was being sort of relocated by FEMA, and a lot of people left because they felt like they would have more opportunities elsewhere, right? So in some ways, like I can look at the storm and I can say it's really devastating, right? And it sort of unmade the community. But when I think about the people that, you know, in my family and in my community that left, some of them remained in the places where they went. Some of them remained in Atlanta. Some of them remained in Houston and other places that they moved to. But a lot of them came back. And and it seems like, you know, they came back because they missed home, you know, and they were from this place where they really felt like part of a community, and they really, you know, they were part of these large extended families, and so they wanted that, right? They wanted to live in a place like that. So then they come back, but they come back into the same situation that they left in some respects, right? I mean, in some ways it was harder for, you know, people in my community to rebuild because, like I said, we don't have any resources, right? So they're coming back to the same struggle in some sense. I don't know if that answered your question. But
yeah, I think it does. I mean, we look at New Orleans and we talk a lot about progress, and then we talk about some of these problems that seem endemic, that seem like, yeah, we've returned to where we were the day before Katrina, or even gone backwards in some ways. We talk about things like social and economic disparity. We talk about crime. It's hard to imagine those things not being endemic to place. And I wonder if you feel that same way about Delisle and about communities along the Gulf Coast, because right after Katrina, there was this moment where that inequity was exposed to the nation, and people were shocked. People were just shocked that there was all this racial disparity going on, and yet if we were living here, we knew that, and in a way perhaps felt complicit in that. And then by coming back, are you agreeing to that? If nothing has changed, are you coming back to a situation where you're agreeing in a way that you will agree to live that way, and in a place that did that to its own people? And is that something you think about and struggle with, that this place that you love, that you're devoted to personally, and that your family is also sort of associated with these wide disparities that right now are really being talked about and exposed in more of a way than ever before, even more so than when Katrina hit?
I mean, I think about it all the time, especially because the kind of characters that I write about, the people that I write about, I mean, most of them, are like the people that I come from, right? Most of them are like, my family members and people in my community, who are all, poor, working class, and who are trapped in many ways, and who feel like they don't have many options in this place. One of the reasons that I decided to come back, to come back to Mississippi and to live in my hometown is because I wanted to serve as an example in some way for, kids in my community, younger people in my community, so they see that, being successful, right, and, sort of, gaining access to the wider world doesn't necessarily mean that you have to leave a place like this, and that there are sometimes ways to be successful and live here and make it work. I mean, I guess in some ways I wanted to, broaden the horizons of possibility for some of the, young people in my neighborhood. But I mean, it's tough because I mean, I've moved back, and I mean, in some ways things are worse now in my community. I think along the coast.
In what ways?
Well, because I mean, right now, my hometown is being hit really hard by the meth epidemic, and it is a real problem, and the cost of living has, gone up. It's like skyrocketed, right?
Really?
And so, yeah, I mean, from like groceries to land taxes and property taxes to rent or mortgage, the like property values. I mean, that has become, there's a big difference from how much it costs to live in the place where I'm from before the storm and how much it costs to live in the place that I'm from after the storm. And it's, I mean, I think it's a struggle for the people that live there.
Yeah. In your book, Men We Reaped, you follow Black men in your life who have died. And when you talk about this idea of being an example for your own community, you're making an argument in a way that place is not fate, that, look, you can be from this place, but you can do other things. And yet, when you look at the lives of the men that you follow in this book, their lives and their deaths, in certain ways, their fate does seem tied to their place. And how do you think about them? Do you ever think about if they had lived somewhere else or gotten out somewhere else, that would not have been their fate?
Yes. And in some ways, I feel in some ways, I feel foolish for being so hopeful. And for thinking that I'm making a difference with the writing that I do, and with, coming back and settling and trying to, to tell young kids like my nephew, who's 19, just graduated from high school, that he can, that he can be successful and that he can prosper in life. I mean, because it's one of the lessons that I learned when I was writing Men We Reaped was like how important place, was to the fates of the young men, that I knew and that I loved. But I think about that all the time. I think that if they, if they had come from other places where there was like real infrastructure and like community resources and, where there was like more job training and, sort of more access to these tools that would help them sort of navigate the world, that they would be alive. Wow. But, the place where I come from, we don't have any of that. I hate
You're
to.
the exception.
I am, and I hate to say that, but I am. I'm the exception, and I feel really guilty about it much of the time.
Well, maybe some of our audience questions can alleviate some guilt. Jessamine, I don't think guilt is a useful way to go with that. I'll stick with hope, maybe a little more than you have. If we have questions from the audience, we have time for just one or two of those. For Jessamine.
Hi, my name is Kara Romanick, and thanks so much. I've read both of Salvage the Bones and The Men We Reaped, and they're just beautiful. And my question is, when I read The Men We Reaped, I cried a lot. There's a lot of heartbreak in that book, and like you do such an amazing job of connecting to that heartbreak and not shielding us from it. But I think what it makes me wonder about is like, how do you, either in your writing or in your community, connect to joy and healing? What's that like for you? And could you talk a little bit more about that?
Thank you. The people in my community find a lot of excuses to get together and just sort of celebrate. Whether we're sort of, celebrating Mother's Day at the local park or sort of getting together, on All Saints Day down at the cemetery and cleaning graves, or, there are these, or getting together, for the sort of annual ball game on Easter Sunday at the local baseball park. Like, I think we access joy by coming together, and it sort of, like helps us to like bolster that sense of community, but then of course sort of also remember our histories and remember our stories, and so I think that's the way that we retain a sense of joy.
We're going to have to end it there, and I like ending on the note of joy. Jesmyn Ward, author of Salvage the Bones, Men We Reaped, Where the Line Bleeds, and some forthcoming books. Thank you so much.
Thank you.